It was upon the upper reaches of the Green River, in the lean season of the early 1830s, when the snows had drawn back from the high shoulders of the Wind River Range, yet the valleys still breathed cold from the night, that the men of the brigade lay huddled around their low fires and spoke in voices meant to avoid the wind. The camp itself was nothing more than a ragged scattering of lodges and lean-to shelters, backed by cottonwoods whose pale bark caught the gray of the moon like old bone. A dozen horses cropped at the sparse grass along the bank, their heads low, their ribs showing through winter-dulled coats, while the river turned slow and iron-dark beside them, whispering its constant, indifferent hymn to stone and time. These were men who had measured their lives in pelts and powder, who knew the slope of every ridge and the smell of weather before it showed itself. Their talk was not idle boasting, though it often carried the rough edge of humor born from cold and hunger. Tonight, however, the murmur that passed among them held less laughter. It was edged with unease and faint curiosity, as though some unwholesome spirit had brushed the circle of flame and left its mark unseen. "He's come again," muttered old Ferris, spitting into the coals, the saliva hissing faintly. "That thin ranger with the Spaniard paper. Says the same tale as last spring. Lost mines, buried silver, crosses cut in red stone." A younger man gave a short bark of laughter. "A tale for fools and greenhorns. No Spaniard laid pick or prayer this far north. Ain't no silver here, but what a liar carries on his tongue." Yet their eyes turned, one by one, toward the edge of the encampment, where a solitary figure sat a little apart from the rest, his back resting against a weathered cottonwood trunk. He moved neither to join their talk nor to avoid it, as if the distance between him and the others was as natural as the margin of a riverbank. He was of middle years, spare in frame but not weak, his posture straight as a man who had long since forgotten the habit of leaning upon the company of others. His buckskin coat bore the scars of hard country, thorn tears, smoke stains, and the dull polish of countless days against rawhide packs and saddle leather. A faded felt hat shadowed his face, and beneath it his eyes were steady, watchful, and untroubled by the weight of their contempt. Across his knees lay the thing they whispered about, a sheet of parchment, folded and creased so many times that it had taken on the pliancy of old bark, its edges cracked and darkened by years of damp and smoke. When he unfolded it, with movements deliberate and careful, the faint lines of Spanish script could be seen, interwoven with crude hand-drawn marks, twisting lines meant to signify ravines, small squares for stoneworks, and crosses where one might imagine the hand of a missionary had once knelt on cold ground and whispered prayers to an empty sky. To the rest of the men it was a curiosity at best and a fool's burden at worst. They had seen too many wanderers come and go, too many men ruined by stories of lost veins and hidden troves. They knew the arithmetic of the mountains. Beaver were real, their pelts tangible, their value weighed and counted. Silver born from old Spanish ghosts was a dream too frail to stake a winter on. "Calls himself a ranger," another voice said, low and disdainful. "Ranger of what? Ain't no army here, no forts to watch. Just rocks, wolves, and men who know better than to chase whispers." The ranger did not raise his head. He traced a finger along one faded line, as if following the route of some long-vanished caravan, his lips pressing faintly together in a concentration that did not waver under the sting of their words. His name meant little among them. He had come and gone on the margins of their trade, never asking to ride in company, never offering boisterous stories or braggart claims. He spoke only when asked, and even then his words came plain and unadorned, as if shaped by a mind more given to observation than noise. It was this quiet that unsettled them. In a world where men rose and fell by their reputations, where bravado was worn like a second hide, his silence felt unnatural. He did not shout of danger to draw admiration, he did not laugh to buy favor. He sat with his map and his conviction, and in that stillness there was something that tugged faintly at the edge of their certainty. The land around them bore witness to both faith and folly. The sweeping sage flats, the pine-dark ridges, The river valleys choked with willow and wild rose, these had carved men down to bone and sinew. Jedediah Smith himself had passed through not so many years before, his journals speaking of thirst, hostile ground, and the grim patience required to cross unknown horizons. Those who had survived learned to distrust anything that could not be set between the teeth or laid upon the scales. They had buried enough companions to know that legends, more often than not, served only to mark the path to an unmarked grave. Yet the ranger's map spoke of an older claim upon this earth. He had said once, in a voice low and steady, that it came from a dying muleteer beyond Taos, a man who spoke of padres laboring under the watch of Spanish banners, carving into mountain stone for veins of white metal, while the surrounding tribes watched with growing resentment and fear. He had told of prayer bells echoing against canyon walls, and of blood-soaking soil that no priest would ever bless again. When the muleteer's breath gave out, the paper passed into the ranger's hands, along with a story too heavy to easily forget. Most had laughed then, too. They had called it the fanciful dying rattle of a man far from home. They had spat and turned away. Only the ranger had folded the parchment with reverence and carried it northward, through frost and hunger, through seasons that stripped hope from lesser men. Tonight, as the fires settled into a dull red glow, a wind drifted down from the high country and whispered among the cottonwoods. Sparks leapt and died. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf gave voice, long and hollow, and the horses shifted uneasily at their tethers. The ranger lifted his eyes at last, scanning the darkened slopes as if reading a message written there by the forgotten centuries. "He believes it," one trapper said quietly, the mockery suddenly thinned of its sharpest edge. "Or he's the finest fool I ever saw." Neither answer sat easy upon the tongue, for belief, when carried with such calm, had a way of unsettling the hardened and the proud. And though no man rose to stand beside him that night, though none stepped forward to ask to see the map more closely, every eye returned to that lone figure more than once before the fire fell to ash. Above them the stars blistered cold and clear against the immense frontier sky, indifferent to mockery and legend alike. Beneath them the river kept its slow, tireless march, as it had long before Spaniard or trapper set eyes upon its banks. And beside its dark water, a ranger sat with an aging scrap of parchment, holding a story no man trusted, yet one that refused, stubbornly, to die. The dawn found the encampment stirred by the muted sounds of leather and iron, by the low snort of horses and the crackle of rekindled embers. Frost clung to the sedge like thin bone-white lace, and breath rose in pale ghosts from the mouths of men who turned their faces eastward to judge the sky. The ranger did not linger for morning talk or shared bread. He rolled his few possessions with the quiet economy of a man long accustomed to solitude, secured the worn parchment within a small oilskin packet, and led his roan horse away from the river with no announcement but the soft jingle of tack. A few eyes followed him, not in open challenge, but with the wary silence, reserved for those whose purpose could not be measured in familiar terms. Among the brigades, purpose was everything. A man who rode for beaver was understood. A man who rode for silver born of forgotten Spaniards occupied a stranger territory, somewhere between courage and folly. He moved south and west, skirting the broken ground where sage yielded to juniper, and the stony ribs of the foothills rose in pale, stubborn angles. The earth here had been trampled by more than hooves. Shoshone paths crossed the landscape in faint, disciplined curves, lines worn by generations who knew the country not as conquest but as kin. The ranger read those trails as he would lines of scripture, halting where they bent unnaturally or where an old fire ring spoke of passage and pause. When he unfurled the map, he did so beyond the eyes of the curious, seeking shelter in the lee of a shale ridge or beneath the shadow of leaning cottonwoods. The Spanish hand upon the page was cramped but precise, the letters curling with a grace alien to the blunt scrawl of Anglo trappers. Certain markings repeated themselves, small flared symbols beside a narrow canyon, a double cross etched near what might have been a seasonal spring. He matched these with the shape of the land before him, letting the rise and fall of stone correct the aging memory of ink. He remembered the muleteer's face, cracked and sunburned, the lips moving with slow, painful effort as the man spoke of a forgotten mission and the sound of picks echoing against canyon walls. The old Spaniard's eyes had held both fear and devotion, as though he feared the ground even as he believed it holy. It was there, near the pueblos east of Taos, that the map had been passed hand to hand, a brittle inheritance tied to whispered absolution. Days unfolded beneath a wide and uncompromising sky. The ranger traveled as Jedediah Smith once had, with restraint, marking the land more than he scarred it, conserving powder, watching the weather with eyes sharpened by memory and foresight. He took few risks, allowing no indulgence in speed. The trapper's art had taught him patience, yet this path required another kind of listening, one not granted to men who rushed toward noise. Occasionally he came upon spoor fresher than his own, another rider's imprint, a broken twig, the dull drag of a pack animal over grit. He did not look to know who followed, he only noted that they did. It was enough. Toward the second evening, the land changed its voice. Stone rose dark and close, the narrow canyon biting into the earth like an old wound. Above it, ravens circled with a slow, curious attention. He dismounted, leading the roan along a ledge where sunlight touched rock in thin, hesitant blade strokes. There it was, half buried beneath lichen, and dust the faint suggestion of a squared stone, worked by a hand that did not belong to wind or frost. His fingers brushed its surface, finding a shallow engraving of a skull and stylized cross. Not a trapper's mark. Not the idle scratch of wandering men. Something older. Something deliberate. The ranger stood long in silence, his breathing measured, his gaze inward. The land had spoken not in voices, but in shape and memory. The map did not lie, yet its truth carried a weight heavier than gold. Far behind him, unseen eyes watched the narrowing path and the slow, deliberate pace of his journey. And ahead, beyond the canyon's darkened mouth, the Spanish past waited patient as buried bone for the footfall of a man who trusted neither rumor nor applause, but only the language of stone and time. The first sign was not a shouted challenge nor the flash of steel, but the sudden stillness that settled upon the land like a held breath. Even the wind, which had wandered restlessly through the canyon's throat, seemed to falter as if aware that men had stepped too close to one another's shadow. The ranger sensed it before he saw it. Years of travel through contested ground had honed an instinct deeper than reason, a tightening in the chest, a quiet urging behind the eyes, the knowledge that unseen feet had begun to draw toward violence. He stood upon a narrow rise overlooking a shallow basin freckled with greasewood and brittle sage. Beyond it wound a thread of creek, and beside that trickle of water 3 figures moved cautiously, rifles slung low, eyes scanning the fringe of timber where the sun slanted thin and dull. Their stiff posture and deliberate pacing marked them as men who did not wander without cause. Trappers, by the look of their dress, but not of his brigade. Their hats bore different creases, their gait the careful stride of those who claimed unfamiliar ground by stubborn presence alone. From the opposite slope came another sound, the scuff of moccasins against stone, deliberate, guarded, and sure. A small band of Shoshone emerged in the half-light, their movements fluid as water, yet taut with coiled readiness. They had followed trails no map governed, moving through the high country in quiet assertion of territory understood not by ink, but by ancestry. The air between the two parties trembled, brittle as dry sinew stretched too far. The ranger descended slowly, never hurrying, never betraying alarm. He knew such moments could topple into blood with the careless twitch of a hand. He saw the tilt of a trapper's rifle as he noticed the Shoshone, the narrowing of eyes, the tightening of jaws. He saw, too, the subtle shift among the native men as they judged the distance, the number, the slope of ground behind each stranger. A voice cracked the air. "This water ain't yours alone," one of the trappers called, his tone thin with forced authority. "We set our line here fair and lawful." No man laughed, no man answered at once. The silence spoke of older grievances than could be solved by borrowed words. The ranger stepped forward then, his presence drawing both sides into a moment of suspended attention. He carried no gesture of threat. His rifle remained resting against his shoulder, his hands steady and open. It was a movement so calm and unhurried that it unsettled more than any abrupt display could have done. "Trouble don't come from the water," he said evenly, his voice clear enough to carry but never raised. "It comes from men forgetting how fast it runs away from them." One trapper spat into the dust. "You got no place in this," he growled. "We didn't ask for sermons." The ranger inclined his head slightly, as if acknowledging a simple truth. "No man ever does," he replied. "But graves fill all the same." His eyes lifted past them, studying the lay of the land as though it were a page he had long since memorized. He saw how the basin narrowed, how the rock rose sharp and ungenerous beneath the northern side, how the creek bent and vanished toward timber. He imagined the path of any ball loosed in anger here, the echo it would raise, the madness it might provoke. Slowly, deliberately, he turned from both groups and walked a few paces to the side. He knelt, resting the barrel of his rifle upon a stone worn smooth by ages of wind and rain. With practiced care he sighted toward a jutting shelf of rock some distance away, a pale slab clinging to the cliff face like bone exposed to sky. The click of his hammer was soft, yet it carried. "Don't," one of the Shoshone murmured, tension sliding into the word like a knife. The ranger did not answer. He breathed once, slow and controlled, then squeezed the trigger. The report cracked through the basin, sharp as lightning. The bullet struck its mark with a dull, wet-sounding thud, splintering the stone and sending a trickle of dust cascading down the face of the cliff. No man flinched toward another, no muzzle turned upon flesh. All eyes followed the path of that single shot and the silent proof it left behind. He rose to his feet, lowering the rifle. "That rock don't care who claims this water," he said. "And it won't care about the bones that lay here if you choose to test one another instead." The men on both sides stood unmoving, the heat of confrontation loosened by the blunt clarity of his display. There was no flourish in his act, no pride, only warning. He turned to the trappers first. "There's beaver further east, where the banks run quiet and the frost breaks kind. You'll gain more there than you will from blood mixed with creek water." Then he looked to the Shoshone, his gaze respectful, restrained. "And this ground holds more worth alive than scarred by iron." No one spoke. The basin remained caught between breath and release. At length, a trapper shifted his rifle down, muttering a curse that carried more frustration than defiance. The Shoshone leader inclined his head slightly, the smallest nod that held centuries of dignity within it. Without ceremony, both groups withdrew, their footsteps receding into their respective paths, leaving only the echo of wind and the dust of shattered stone to mark what might have been a killing ground. The ranger remained alone once more, standing amid silence that felt heavier than the shot itself. He wiped his hands upon his leggings and reloaded his rifle with a care as methodical as prayer. In that moment, he bore not the look of a hero nor the stance of a conqueror, but the terrible calm of a man who understood that restraint often demanded more strength than anger ever could. Far off, unseen eyes watched again those of men who had laughed around last night's fire, now carrying a different shade of thought behind their gaze. They had heard the echo of that rifle long before its sound reached them on the wind. And though none spoke it aloud, something within them had shifted like earth after a quiet tremor. For among those harsh valleys and indifferent peaks, it had become known that a war need not always be fought to be ended, and somewhere between the dust and the whispering creek, the ranger who carried a myth in his saddle had halted a storm with a single, measured breath and a shot that carried no thirst for blood. The canyon into which the ranger descended was narrow and unwelcoming, its walls drawing close, as though reluctant to admit even the slow patience of a solitary man. Sunlight filtered down in pale, uncertain shafts that touched the rock only briefly before surrendering again to shadow. The air carried the cool scent of damp stone, mingled with the faint, dry bitterness of lichen and old dust, a smell that spoke not of living growth, but of endurance beyond the reckoning of men. He moved with care, each step chosen as if the very ground beneath him might remember forgotten trespass. The roan followed without complaint, its hooves knocking softly against stone, the sound echoing once, then fading, swallowed by the canyon's depth. Above, the ravens had fallen silent, and even the wind no longer dared intrude so boldly. There, half hidden by bramble and grit, he saw it more clearly now, the squared stones he had earlier brushed with his hand. Laid with a deliberation foreign to the rough indifference of the frontier, they formed the low remnants of a wall, perhaps once part of a crude enclosure or shelter. Time had softened their edges, but the intent of human labor had not entirely vanished. He knelt slowly, placing his palm against the cool surface. It carried no warmth, only the mute memory of hands long turned to dust. Along one slab faint etchings remained, a worn Spanish cross, scarcely more than a suggestion now, and beside it a crescent scar, where steel had once bitten deep into granite. These were not marks of wandering trappers or bored voyageurs. These were the signatures of a people who had come not to roam but to claim. He unfolded the map once more, spreading it upon a flat stone with reverence that bordered on ritual. The paper trembled faintly under. His fingers, aged and brittle, yet its faded lines stubbornly held their course. The canyon drawn upon it curved much like the one before him, and the symbol marked beside this bend resembled closely the carved cross beneath his hand. He let his gaze move between parchment and land, the two forming a quiet, undeniable correspondence. A little further along the canyon's belly he found what time had tried but failed to fully erase the outline of an adit, its entrance sagging where timber supports had long since rotted and collapsed. The earth above had caved slightly, swallowing the mouth of the passage as though seeking to hide the violence done to it. Yet within the shadow he glimpsed the faint gleam of stone that had known the strike of iron, the shallow grooves where picks had once bitten in desperate rhythm. He did not enter at once. The past carried its own warning, and the ranger treated it with the respect one gives a sleeping predator. Instead, he circled the site, noting every trace the Spaniards had left behind. A broken fragment of weathered wood, gray as ash. A length of rusted iron, twisted as if abandoned in haste. And higher upon the slope, a scatter of small stones arranged in a pattern too deliberate for mere collapse. He thought of those who had labored here, padres murmuring prayers beneath a foreign sun, soldiers standing watch with muskets resting heavy across their knees, chained men perhaps bent beneath the weight of Spanish ambition. He imagined the sound of picks echoing up the canyon wall, the droning of voices in strange cadence, and the day when all that clamor ceased in sudden, violent silence. The earth remembered such moments even when men preferred not to. It remembered in fractures and scars, in stone laid too carefully to be dismissed as nature's whim. The ranger crouched again before the adit and tested the ground with the butt of his rifle, ensuring its firmness. Only when he was satisfied did he step closer, peering into the dark. Cold air spilled outward from the buried passage, carrying the stale breath of long-sealed depths. Somewhere within, a faint trickle of water echoed, a sound steady and hollow as a forgotten heartbeat. He struck a small spark and lit a length of pitch, the flame flaring pale gold against the surrounding gloom. With slow resolve, he stepped inward, the light carving trembling shapes along the rock walls as they narrowed around him. The passage bore the unmistakable signature of human assault, straight lines where the natural formation would have curved, sharp angles where stone had been forced to surrender. After several paces, he halted. Before him rose a section of wall darker than the rest, its surface veined faintly with pale streaks that glimmered faintly even beneath the dim flare. He traced one line with his finger and felt the subtle granulation beneath his skin. Silver. It was there, as the map had promised. Not abundance, not fortune as dreamers' butchery. Imagined, but enough to confirm that the old parchment had not lied. Enough to justify faith, and enough perhaps to draw men hungry for more than mere pelts. He extinguished the pitch and stepped carefully back into the clean breath of open air. The sky above had dulled toward evening, thin clouds painting the horizon in a wash of ashen violet. He folded the map once more, his expression unchanged. though within him the quiet certainty of truth had taken root. He did not smile. He did not whisper, praise, or curse. The knowledge of the mines lived now inside his silence, heavy with potential and peril. Beyond the canyon rim, faint and distant, the murmur of approaching voices drifted along the wind, the unmistakable murmur of men who had followed his trail farther than was wise. He did not turn to face them yet. He only rested his hand upon the stone scarred by Spanish prayer and violence alike, as if listening to what the mountain itself might counsel. And in that dimming light, amid stones that whispered of silver and blood, the ranger understood that discovery was never the end of a journey, only the moment when consequence at last took its first and most fragile breath. They did not come with laughter now. The men who crested the rim above the canyon moved in a manner altogether changed from the rough boldness they had once worn so carelessly around the firelight of the Green River. Their boots struck the stony ground with a measured caution. Their eyes searched the narrowing gorge, not for sport, but for understanding. The silence that clung to their passage carried more weight than open challenge ever could. There were 6 of them, seasoned trappers by the cut of their coats and the weathered lines set into their faces. Their names had once meant little to the ranger, as his had meant little to them. Yet he recognized the cast of their kind immediately. Men who had wintered hard, men who had crossed ice with empty bellies, men who had buried partners and turned their backs upon the shallow comforts of settled ground. Among them stood Ferris, the eldest of the brigade, and with him a younger man whose laughter had rung sharpest the night before. They halted a few rods beyond him, their gazes settling not upon their rifles, but upon the scarred stone and the map case resting near his hand. "We tracked your sign," Ferris said at last, his voice stripped of unease but no longer laced with mockery. "You ride like a man carrying purpose." The ranger inclined his head slightly, neither welcoming nor rebuking them. "Purpose travels quiet," he answered. "Loudness draws eyes that do not care for it." The younger trapper swallowed, shifting his weight. "We saw the mark you left on the rock yonder," he said, nodding toward the shattered slab from the previous skirmish. No man in camp spoke another jest after hearing that sound drift back on the wind. The ranger did not reply. He returned his attention to the face of the canyon, as if listening to a conversation older than any beside him. In this stillness, the men found themselves oddly unsettled, standing before a resolve that did not beg their approval nor require their faith. "We ain't here to take," Ferris went on, "nor to scoff as fools any more. We came to see if what you follow bears truth, or if you chase only dust and old Spaniard bones." A faint pause filled the space between them. Wind stirred the sage, whispering low along stone, and somewhere a bird gave a brief, questioning cry before retreating into silence again. "There is stone here that has known iron," the ranger said quietly. "And there is silver beneath it enough to prove the map spoke true. Nothing beyond that has yet been earned." A murmur passed through the group, not of elation, but of sober recognition. A confirmed truth carried its own gravity, heavier than rumor or dream. No man stepped forward. No hand reached toward the canyon mouth. Instead they stood, measuring the words with the caution of men who had survived long enough to distrust sudden fortune. Ferris nodded once. "We figured as much might be the case," he said. "And that's why we held back till now. Mines draw company as sure as fire draws moths, and more often than not, the company shoots first." The ranger's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied them. "Then you understand why I do not shout of what lies here." "We understand enough to know this ain't matter for careless tongues," Ferris replied. He glanced to his companions, each of whom carried the look of a man weighing loyalty against hunger. "We followed your silence, not to disturb it, but to walk behind it if you hold no objection." Such an admission would have come unthinkable from these men days before. In their world, respect was not offered lightly. It grew slow, as stubborn as moss upon granite, rooted only in actions, witnessed and weighed without embellishment. The ranger looked once more toward the sealed mouth of the old Spanish adit. Beyond that darkness waited questions no single man had the strength to answer alone. Yet with company came risk. Greed, once freshly stirred, knew no boundary but death. "You walk here, you walk restrained," he said at last. "No pick strikes stone without careful thought. No voice carries beyond the lift of these walls. This ground holds memory, and memory may turn against fools." A sober assent passed among them. "We'll keep our tongues short and our hands longer upon powder than metal," Ferris replied. They descended slowly, careful of footing, careful of noise. Each man stepped as though invading a chapel rather than a prospect. The canyon swallowed their presence whole, and with it took whatever bravado still clung faintly to their bones. They stood before the adit in a line, gazing upon its darkened mouth as one might look upon a grave newly opened. The ranger lit a fresh pitch and let its glow touch the stone face, revealing once more the pale veins whispering of hidden depth. He saw the hunger flicker behind their eyes, the glimmer of possibility, of imagined wealth yet tempered now by unease. "This silver won't sing sweet," he murmured. "Not the way beaver fur does when coin passes hand to hand. This here will draw men who ain't learned quiet ways, men who trade bullet for blessing." The younger trapper exhaled slowly. "And yet," he said, "we stand before it all the same." "Yes," the ranger replied. "That is the shape of temptation." They lingered only briefly, enough to acknowledge truth without surrendering to its hunger. When they turned away, it was with a restraint that spoke louder than oaths. Behind them the canyon returned to stillness, its secrets folded once more beneath earth and shadow. As darkness gathered along the rim and the first pale stars crept into the widening sky, the men mounted their horses in quiet formation. No songs accompanied their ride, no grand plans thundered forth. Only the unspoken knowledge that they had crossed a line, invisible yet deeply felt within the marrow of their kind. And as they followed the ranger back toward the waiting wild, they understood at last why silence had chosen him and why they, in their stubborn wake, had begun to follow it too. Night settled over the high country with a chill that crept bone deep, lingering long after the last ember of day surrendered its pale hold upon the ridgeline. The moon rose slow and pallid above the cañada's broken lip, carving the land into bands of silver and shadow. In its quiet light the stone seemed cold as memory, and the wind carried a whisper not born of weather alone. The ranger knew the stillness had turned watchful. He had sensed it in the tightening of the horses, in the way the men rode closer now than they had the day before, in the subtle shift of eyes that had once followed only their own, survival, and now measured every darkened hollow for the promise of threat. They made camp not along the creek, but higher upon a narrow bench of ground where stone backed them and sight stretched clean across the slope. No fire was raised beyond a faint glow coaxed low and hidden behind rock, enough to warm hands but not to announce presence. It was there, beneath that reluctant moon, that the night's quiet broke. A stone slid somewhere unseen, soft but deliberate, a movement that spoke not of wandering beast but of cautious human step. The ranger did not rise at once. He breathed once, slow as frost gathering along grass, and listened. Another faint sound followed, the brush of cloth against sage, a muffled curse hastily swallowed. He signaled the men with a hand raised low and still. They stiffened instantly, rifles half lifted, eyes narrowing toward the fringe of shadow where darkness thickened deepest. "We're not here for words," a voice carried from beyond the slope, barely louder than the night itself. "You walk heavy over ground that ain't yours to claim alone." Shapes moved, then 3, perhaps 4 silhouettes edging forward, rifles resting careless but ready across their arms. The moon revealed only fragments of their faces, beards grown uneven with hard miles, eyes sharp with suspicion, the lean sinew of men who had learned to take what could be reached. Ferris muttered under his breath. Word travels fast when silver shows its teeth. The ranger stepped forward, no weapon raised, his posture steady as if addressing men who had lost their way rather than enemies who had come seeking advantage. "This ground owes none of us," he said evenly. "No man yet alive dug what sleeps beneath it." One of the strangers laughed low, without humor. "Ain't here to honor ghosts. We came on honest rumor, same as you." "And rumor breeds thicker than blood where greed walks," the ranger replied. The air between them tightened, taut, as a drawn cord. The moon hung pale and indifferent, casting faint glimmer upon rifle barrels that now shifted ever so slightly toward aim. He saw it, the minute tilt of a muzzle, the twitch of a finger. All the old calculus of violence spoke clear as daylight. Time narrowed into a razor-edge moment where choice decided whether men lived or departed, strangled pride and breath. The ranger moved first, not toward flesh, but toward the surest silence. His rifle sang once more under the cold moon, the crack rolling harsh and final against the canyon face. The ball struck a jutting limb above the intruders, splintering bark and sending a cascade of pale wood and dust showering down upon them. The branch fell hard between both parties. A sudden white scar across the knight's dark chest. A heartbeat of stunned quiet followed. He lowered the barrel only slightly, his voice unshaken. "Next one don't strike timber." The shapes halted. The confidence that had driven them now cracked, like frost-bitten glass. One shifted backward, boots scuffing earth, while another lifted his free hand instinctively in a gesture of pause. "We ain't looking to die over rumor," one called, the earlier bravado thin as dry leaves. "Then step back while rumor still breathes," the ranger replied. "This land don't forget men who stain it needlessly, and neither do we." A tense second stretched long as winter memory. Then, slowly, reluctantly, the strangers stepped away, their silhouettes dissolving back into the scattered cover of night. The slope reclaimed its quiet, but the air remained heavy with what might have been. Only after their retreat did the ranger lower his rifle fully. The men around him exhaled, breaths pale as smoke in the cold. No one spoke for a moment. The moonlight seemed brighter now, though no warmth came with it. "You aimed mercy quicker than most aim anger," Ferris murmured. "Mercy leaves ground unspoiled," the ranger answered, "and keeps the living from dreaming too loud." They stood watch in shifts until the moon climbed higher, and the night's edge dulled. No further footsteps pressed the slope, but sleep came thin and cautious, as if every man felt the mountain's breath near his own pulse. When dawn bled faint pink over the eastern ridge, the camp stirred slow and sober. The men spoke little of what had transpired. They needed no recounting. The silence itself bore record. The stranger's presence, the shot, the choice not taken, all lingered heavier than open conflict ever could. As they rode onward beneath the paling sky, the ranger sensed a change, deeper still, not in the men around him, but in the unseen currents of the land. Word would travel beyond their line of sight, and others would come hungrier, louder, less tempered by cold wisdom. The silver's whisper had reached ears that knew no restraint, and beneath the weary promise of morning he understood the truth, carved sharper than either blade or bullet, that violence need not be welcome to leave its smoke in the soul of a place, and that peace, once spared, walked always upon the narrowest edge of choice. The land returned slowly to its older rhythm. Morning came pale and brittle, the sky drawn thin as stretched linen across the ridgeline. Frost clung to the grasses where men had lain sleepless, and the faint curl of their breath hung low before fading into the vast quiet of open air. Beneath such a sky, the silver lost its urgency. The mountains did not glimmer with promise or dread. They simply endured, indifferent to the brief stirrings of men. The ranger rode first, neither hurried nor delayed, his path set not by ambition, but by an inward compass shaped from something quieter than hunger. The others followed at a respectful distance, their earlier sharpness dulled into solemn contemplation. There were no more jokes about Spanish fables, no whispered schemes of fortune, only the steady creak of leather and the occasional scrape of hooves across stone. They had seen enough to know that legend was rarely born from noise and never sustained by greed alone. By mid-morning the land opened again into familiar wind-brushed flats, the river bending distant and slow through yellowing banks. They halted at a place where the sage grew sparse and the ground gave way to silence. It was there the ranger drew his horse to a stop. "This is far enough," he said quietly. Ferris turned, studying him with eyes that no longer judged. "You mean to turn back?" "I mean to leave the matter as the land had planned it long before any of us rode this far," the ranger answered. What sleeps beneath those stones wasn't meant to serve every hand that reaches for it. A pause gathered around his words. The others shifted uneasily, as men confronted with a choice that had already been decided for them, somewhere beyond argument. "You walk away from silver proven real," the younger trapper murmured, disbelief tracing the edges of his voice. "I walk away from what silver would make of men who forget themselves," the ranger replied, "and from what men would make of this ground once hunger turned to claim." No one answered him at once. They looked instead to the distant shoulder of the canyon, its entrance no longer visible. In their minds lingered the pale gleam upon stone and the weight of its whispered promise. Ferris exhaled slowly. "You'll not speak of it again? Not sell the map in some crowded town where louder men trade lies for coin?" The ranger looked down at the worn map case tied carefully beside his saddle. "A thing carried long enough becomes bound to the earth. It names," he said. "This one has named enough." Without ceremony, he reached into his pack and withdrew the folded parchment. It was more fragile now than ever, its edges soft as burlap, its markings faint as echo. He unfolded it one last time beneath the open sky, the Spanish script, catching the fading light like shadows remembered. The men watched in silence as he lowered the paper to the ground and struck a small flame beside it. The fire licked slowly along the brittle edge, curling the ink, consuming years of whispered obsession into ash that drifted upward and vanished upon the breeze. No one spoke. The land itself seemed to lean closer, as though bearing witness. When the last corner blackened and surrendered, the ranger drew back, his face unreadable, though something like quiet liberation passed briefly through his eyes. "The mine will live longer as silence," he said, "and so might we." The men nodded without protest. They understood now. Whatever wealth had been poised to claim them had lost its hold. The idea of returning with shovels and banners suddenly felt small, almost profane against the wide breadth of untouched hills. A moment later, the ranger turned his horse toward the open west and began to ride. He gave no farewell, knowing they required none. His back seemed already a silhouette, dissolving into the geography of stone and sky, another figure swallowed into the quiet measure of high country. They did not follow. Word traveled nonetheless, as word always did among wandering men. At trapping posts and river meets, beneath the rough timbers of frontier forts, men spoke half in jest and half in reverence of the stranger who had carried a Spanish map and walked away from proven silver. Some swore the mines never existed. Others claimed the hills still hid them, untouched by iron, untouched by ruin. But none could say where the ranger had gone. Seasons passed. The fur trade shifted. New names rose and fell along the distant frontier. Yet in rare moments, when evening settled gently upon unfamiliar slopes, certain men found their gaze drawn to quiet places, to canyons where stone bore faint scars, and to ridgelines where silence felt deliberate rather than empty. There, they remembered a man no crowd had crowned, whose strength was measured not by conquest but by refusal, and whose greatest claim had been the boundary he chose never to cross. Long after tracks vanished and fires cooled, the land remained unchanged by shovel or violence. The Spanish silver slept undisturbed beneath careful stone. And somewhere beyond the reach of rumor, a ranger continued onward, known only by the echo he left behind, a myth shaped not by greed or glory, but by restraint and the quiet dignity of a path unclaimed.